The Red Tail Protocol. A story of excellence, prejudice, and impossible courage. The burden of perfection. The year was 1943 and Captain Jim Mitchell sat in the cockpit of his P-51 Mustang at Ramitelli Air Base in Italy, watching the runway stretch out before him like a promise and a curse combined. His hands steady and sure despite the weight of what lay ahead, gripped the control stick with the precision of a surgeon. Behind him, 14 other pilots, all of them black, all of them members of the legendary Tuskegee Airmen, waited for his signal. The war had taught Jim something that no flight academy could have prepared him for. Perfection was not an option for men who looked like him. It was a requirement. The orders had come down that morning, a long-range escort mission over occupied France, protecting BB-82 flying fortresses on a bombing run deep into enemy territory. It was the kind of mission that tested not just a pilot's technical skill, but his nerve, his judgment, and his ability to maintain focus when every instinct screamed at him to break formation and run. Jen thought of the words "From ek Peter duita beje baro minute," which his mother had written in a letter he still carried in his flight suit. "Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us." She had written those words not knowing, perhaps, how directly they would apply to his life as a black pilot in the segregated military of 1943. The burden of perfection began long before Jem ever sat in a fighter aircraft. It began the day he was born black in America. It intensified the day he decided to pursue his dream of becoming a pilot, a dream that many said was impossible, that the military said was impossible, that even some of his own community whispered about with doubt. And it crystallized into absolute necessity the day he became one of the first black combat pilots in American military history. Every mission was a statement. Every perfect landing was a refutation of the stereotype. Every successful kill was proof against the prejudice that whispered that black men didn't have the courage, the intelligence, or the nerve to fly combat aircraft. Every moment he spent in the air, he was not just fighting the enemy. He was fighting an entire system that had been constructed on the assumption of his inferiority. The other pilots knew this too. They didn't speak about it much, but it was understood. Colonel Benjamin O'Davisger, the commander of the Tinshobotrishan fighter group, the official unit designation of the Tuskegee Airmen, had made it clear in his own way, you will not give them any excuse. You will not confront their prejudices. You will be twice as good and work twice as hard. And you will do it with grace. This was not just military discipline. This was survival. This was the price of the opportunity they had been given, an opportunity that had taken a lawsuit, national protest, and the intervention of the highest levels of government to secure. Jim had always been a perfectionist. His mother had raised him that way. His father, a college professor, had instilled in him the belief that excellence was not arrogance, it was a form of service. But flying for the Tuskegee program had elevated that perfectionism to an entirely new level. Now, perfection was not personal ambition. It was a moral imperative. "Red flight, you're cleared for takeoff," came the tower's voice through his headset. Jem advanced the throttle, feeling the P-51 Mustang respond with the eager power that made this aircraft one of the finest fighters in the world. The plane accelerated down the runway, the roar of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine filling his ears and his chest with vibration and possibility. He had flown this plane dozens of times, but every takeoff still felt like a prayer answered. A black man, born in Alabama, now commanding the most advanced military technology in the world. It was an impossibility that had somehow become real. As his wheels left the tarmac, Jim glanced in his mirror and saw 14 more Mustangs lifting off behind him in perfect formation. His men. His brothers. Each of them carrying the same burden of perfection that he carried. Each of them aware that their performance reflected not just on themselves, but on every black person fighting to claim their place in American society. If you've never heard about the incredible story of the Tuskegee Airmen and their legendary combat record, you need to subscribe to this channel right now and hit like so we can bring you more of these hidden histories that changed American aviation forever. The flight to the rendezvous point with the BB-82 took 45 minutes of steady flying through scattered clouds. Jen maintained perfect formation with his wingman, his eyes constantly scanning the sky for enemy fighters. Below them, the landscape of occupied Europe stretched out, a patchwork of forests and villages and the infrastructure of war. The WW2 formation appeared on schedule, a massive armada of heavy bombers that represented the might of the Allied Air Force. GEM's responsibility was absolute. Those bombers had to get through. The mission profile was clear: fly escort, maintain formation discipline, engage any German fighters that appeared, and ensure maximum coverage of the bomber fleet. It was a mission that would have seemed routine to most experienced pilots. But there was nothing routine about it. The Tuskegee Airmen operated under constraints that their white counterparts did not. They were restricted to certain theaters of operation. They were not assigned to the most prestigious missions. They had been fought for, practically begged for, by activists and military officers who believed that race should not determine capability. But even with all the fighting, prejudice remained, subtle, pervasive, and deeply embedded in the military command structure. What GEM and his pilots had to do was prove, through sheer excellence, that those constraints were not only immoral but also strategically stupid. That by limiting the deployment of these pilots, the military was handicapping its own war effort. As they flew deeper into enemy territory, GEM began to sense something in his intuition, something that came from hundreds of hours of training and from an instinct that had been honed through combat experience. The German fighters would be coming. They always did. Bandits at 2 o'clock high, came the voice of his wingman, Lieutenant Harold "Hawk" Williams. 4 of them. Maybe 6. They're diving. GEM's response was instantaneous. Every ounce of training, every moment of preparation, crystallized into action. Break formation. Engage it well. Protect the bombers. Go. What followed was a display of aerial combat that would later be documented in intelligence reports and studied at flight academies for decades to come. The P-51 Mustang, in the hands of these pilots, became something more than mere machine. It became an extension of will, of training, of pure aeronautical expertise. GEM climbed hard, using the Mustang's superior climb rate to gain altitude advantage over the German WW2 that had descended from above. The first enemy fighter passed beneath him, and he dove, using gravity and the plane's remarkable speed to pursue. The German pilot, seeing what he was dealing with, attempted evasive maneuvers, but GEM had anticipated the move. His hands on the stick were perfect expressions of spatial reasoning and split-second decision-making. The guns fired. Tracers cut through the air. The German fighter took hits, smoke pouring from its engine. GEM pushed the Mustang harder, maintaining pressure, not allowing the enemy pilot any opportunity to recover or escape. The fighter fell away, trailing smoke and flame. One down. Around him, the ski filled with the geometry of aerial combat, 15 different dogfights occurring in a space defined only by the limits of aircraft performance and pilot skill. His men, Lieutenants Turner, Jackson, Williams, and a dozen others, were executing maneuvers that pushed their aircraft and themselves to the absolute edge of human capability. The Mustang was a superior aircraft, but it was superior only in the hands of superior pilots. The genius of the Tuskegee Airmen lay not just in the planes they flew, but in the incredible level of preparation, training, and flying skill they brought to the cockpit. These were men who had fought for the right to fly, who had proved themselves against every awe and barrier that had been placed before them, who understood that mediocrity was not permitted, that excellence was their only option. By the time the engagement ended, GEM's flight had achieved 4 confirmed kills. No bombers had been lost under their protection. The mission had been a success. Leave a comment below and tell me, what do you think modern fighter pilots would shy if they learned about the Tuskegee Airmen's mission success rate? Your perspective matters, and I want to hear it. As GEM guided his remaining aircraft back toward base, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. They had done it again. They had proven, once more, that excellence transcends color, that capability is not determined by race, and that when you remove the artificial constraints placed on human potential, the results can be extraordinary. But satisfaction was a luxury that could only last a moment. There would be debriefings. There would be reports to file. And there would be the knowledge that, despite their success, despite their perfect record, despite their unmatched performance in combat, there would still be officers back at base who questioned whether black pilots truly belonged in the air. That was the burden that never lifted. The statistics tell a story that modern military analysts still find remarkable. The Tuskegee Airmen, operating in the Mediterranean and European theaters, achieved a combat record that was, by any measure, exceptional. They flew more than Ek-500 combat missions. They earned more than Ek-50 distinguished flying crosses. They had the highest pilot retention rate of any fighter group in the entire US Air Force. And perhaps most significantly, they never lost a single bomber they were assigned to protect, a record that remains unmatched to this day. These numbers existed not in spite of the discrimination and prejudice these pilots faced, but in some ways, because of it the selection process for the Tuskegee program had been designed to prove that black pilots could fly. This meant that every pilot selected had to be exceptional. Every candidate had to meet standards that were higher than those applied to white pilot candidates. The training was more rigorous. The evaluation process was more stringent. In essence, the military had created a program designed to prove that black pilots were inferior, and had instead created the most elite fighter pilot unit in the entire war. Captain Jim Mitchell understood this paradox on a visceral level. He had been turned down by flight schools before Tuskegee. He had been told, directly and indirectly, that he didn't have the right background, the right temperament, the right quality for military aviation. Tuskegee had given him the opportunity to prove those evaluations wrong. But Tuskegee had also given him something else, a community of excellence. The pilots, ground crews, mechanics, and support staff of the Tuskegee program had all been selected through the same rigorous process. They had all been told they were inferior and had chosen to prove otherwise. The culture Thies created was one of absolute commitment to perfection. In the pilots' ready room at Ramatali, there was an unofficial motto that had emerged among the men: "We ain't got no excuses." It meant that whatever challenges they faced, whatever prejudice they encountered, whatever limitations were placed on them by a segregated military, they would not accept those as reasons for anything less than perfection. This mentality extended to every aspect of their operation. The ground crews maintained the aircraft with meticulous care. The mechanics performed their work with precision. The pilots stood at every mission briefing as if their lives depended on it, which, of course, they did. And the leadership, under Colonel Benjamin Odedisger, enforced a standard of excellence that was unrelenting. Jim had witnessed the colonel's response to a pilot who had filed a complaint about the segregated officers' club at a nearby base. The colonel had listened carefully, had acknowledged the injustice, and then had essentially said, "You're right. It's wrong. And we're going to prove it's wrong by being so good at what we do that they can't ignore us." That's how change happens. Not through bitterness, but through undeniable excellence. It was a lesson that Jim carried with him every time he strapped into his P-51. Excellence was not just about winning in combat. It was about transforming the entire system through the power of undeniable performance. As Jim reviewed the combat footage and photographs from their latest mission, something struck him that he had noticed before but had never fully articulated: the modern jets that the experimental programs were beginning to develop, jets that could fly higher, faster, and farther than any piston-powered aircraft, would eventually make planes like the P-51 obsolete. But there was something about the P-51 in the hands of a skilled pilot that even future technology might not replicate: the intimate connection between pilot and machine. Flying a P-51 required a profound understanding of aerodynamics, of the plane's capabilities and limitations, of energy management and tactical positioning. You couldn't rely on raw speed and altitude advantage. You had to be a pilot in the truest sense, an artist with the control stick, a tactician in the air, a student of the basics of flight. The Tuskegee Airmen had been forced to master these fundamentals because they had less margin for error. They had to be better not just marginally, but significantly better, to overcome the limitations they faced. And in the process of achieving that level of excellence, they had become some of the finest combat pilots the world had ever seen. If this story has inspired you and made you see American history differently, please like this video and subscribe so we can continue bringing you these incredible narratives that have been hidden for too long. The Tuskegee Airmen deserve to be remembered as heroes. The war ended, and Jim Mitchell returned to civilian life. But the world he returned to was still segregated, still prejudiced, still resistant to the idea that black men could excel at anything, much less warfare. Yet something had changed. The photographs existed. The combat records existed. The testimony of bomber crews who had been protected by the Red Tails existed. The evidence was undeniable. In 1948, President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the armed forces. The Tuskegee Airmen had proven, through their excellence in combat, that segregation in the military was not just immoral, it was inefficient. It was a waste of human potential. Jim continued his military career, eventually retiring as a brigadier general. But his greatest pride was not in his rank. It was in what he and his fellow Tuskegee Airmen had accomplished. They had flown missions in a segregated war, under impossible constraints, and had achieved a record that remains unmatched to this day. Decades later, Jim found himself reflecting on the passage from Peter that his mother had written to him all those years ago. Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. In his own way, that was exactly what the Tuskegee Airmen had done. They had lived lives of such excellence, had demonstrated such capability, had proven themselves so thoroughly that eventually, the system that had opposed them had to acknowledge their valor. The comparison between the red tails and modern fighter jets that would sometimes be made in historical articles was, in Jim's mind, somewhat misleading. Yes, an F-35 was faster, higher, and farther than a T-51 Mustang. But the F-35 represented the accumulated technological advancement of decades. It was not a measure of the individual pilot's skill, but of the system capability. The P-51 Mustang, in the hands of a Tuskegee Airman pilot, represented something different. It represented the absolute peak of what a human being, through training and determination and courage, could achieve. It represented the marriage of man and machine at a level that required the pilot to understand every aspect of both. Modern pilots were, without question, incredibly skilled. But they operated within systems that did much of the thinking for them. The Tuskegee Airmen had flown in an era where the pilot's personal skill, judgment, and decision-making were the critical factors determining success or failure in combat. In that sense, what they had accomplished was perhaps even more remarkable than anything modern aviation had achieved. They had taken an aircraft that was good, and through superior training and superior skill, had made it into something extraordinary. Jim loved to see the Tuskegee Airmen finally receive the recognition they deserved. In 2007, they were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor in the United States. But by that time, many of the original pilots had passed away. Many had never received official recognition for what they had accomplished. Yet recognition from the world had never been what drove these men. What had driven them was something deeper, a commitment to excellence in the face of prejudice. A determination to prove that capability transcends color. A faith that, eventually, truth and justice would prevail. Jim Mitchell passed away in 2012, at the age of 92. His funeral was attended by fellow pilots, military officers, and people whose lives had been touched by his story. They spoke of his courage, his skill, his quiet dignity in the face of discrimination. What they didn't speak as much about was something equally important, the example he had set for future generations. That excellence is the most powerful form of protest. That perfection in the face of prejudice is a revolutionary act. That flying a fighter aircraft in F-35 as a black man was not just a military mission, it was a statement about the future of America. The Tuskegee Airmen had flown missions in aircraft that, by the standards of the 21st century, were primitive. But they had flown with a level of skill and dedication that modern pilots, flying aircraft 1,000 times more sophisticated, would be waste to study and attempt to emulate. Because what they had truly flown was a mission beyond mere combat. They had flown a mission to change the world. And in that mission, they succeeded beyond measure. In the end, that is the true legacy of the Red Tails, not just a perfect combat record, not just the destruction of enemy aircraft, not just the protection of bomber crews. The true legacy was the transformation of American society through the power of undeniable excellence, the proof that when you remove artificial barriers and allow human potential to flourish, the results can change the course of history. Thank you for watching this story of courage, excellence, and the triumph of the human spirit. If the Tuskegee Airmen's legacy has moved you, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment telling us, what does true excellence mean to you, and how do you think the world would be different if we all refused to accept limits placed on us by prejudice? Your stories deserve to be heard. The lesson for the modern age. Nearly 80 years after Jim Mitchell flew his first combat mission, the lesson of the Tuskegee Airmen remains profoundly relevant. In an age of artificial intelligence, advanced technology, and systems that can perform calculations faster than the human mind, we might be tempted to think that individual human excellence has become less important. The story of the Red Tails suggests otherwise. What the Tuskegee Airmen demonstrated was that excellence is not the product of favorable circumstances. It is the product of commitment, training, determination, and a refusal to accept mediocrity. They flew inferior aircraft by later standards, under worse conditions, with fewer resources, and against greater prejudice. And they outperformed every other fighter group in the war. That lesson applies not just to aviation, but to every field of human endeavor. Excellence is not a privilege granted by circumstances. It is a choice made by individuals who decide that they will do their work to the highest standard, regardless of the obstacles placed before them. The Red Tails flew with a level of discipline and precision that modern military analysts still find remarkable. They flew in formation with perfect spacing. They maintained radio discipline under combat conditions. They executed maneuvers that pushed their aircraft to the absolute limits of aeronautical capability. They did this not because they had to, but because they understood that excellence was their responsibility, to themselves, to their unit, to the cause of justice, and to God. In 1 Corinthians 10:31, Paul writes, "So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God." The Tuskegee Airmen understood this principle, even if they didn't always articulate it in those exact words. They understood that their excellence in the cockpit was a form of service, not just to the military, but to something larger than themselves. That is why their legacy endures. Not because they were the fastest or the highest-flying pilots of their era, though they may well have been, but because they understood that excellence is a moral imperative, a way of bearing witness to truth, and a tool for transforming the world. The P-51 Mustang is now in museums. The F-35 and other modern fighters represent the cutting edge of aviation technology. But the principle that the Tuskegee Airmen embodied, that human excellence, discipline, and determination can overcome any obstacle, that principle will never become obsolete. That is the true legacy of the Red Tails, not aircraft performance, but human potential. Not speed and altitude, but character and courage. Not just military victory, but the victory of the human spirit over prejudice, over limitation, over the countless forces that would tell us that we are not good enough. The Tuskegee Airmen proved those forces wrong. And in doing so, they changed the world.